I want to start with, as she does, you mentioned I.F. Stone, his book Underground to Palestine. But I found that this, on the one hand, you had the left, I.F. Stone being part of the counterculture, but this identification of the counterculture with this settler colonial state. And as you said, I.F. Stone recants. I'm just going to read that little passage. This is his book, Underground to Palestine, his first book. Stone's book included the major tropes of the narrative that progressive Americans told about Zionism in the years following World War II. His personal discovery of kinship with the Jews of Europe added poignancy. He realized that if his parents had emigrated from Russia to America, he might have gone to the gas chambers or ended up a ragged, quote-unquote, and homeless refugee. As he drew closer to his Jewish brothers, he recorded their plaintive Yiddish songs, which expressed longing for a world lost to catastrophic violence. At the same time, he narrated their journey in resolutely American tones. That's a fundamental theme of the book. As a story of rebirth, in the transformative voyage from the old world to the new. In contrast to the defeatist spirit hovering over a shattered Europe, he was amazed by the tremendous vitality of the refugees and by their determination to build a new life in a new land. In his book, Stone focused on the journey, not the arrival, chronicling the dream of a Jewish homeland uncluttered by Arab realities that disrupted these dreams, realities that he had noted in his earlier reports from Palestine. Let's talk about that link between the left, and Stone was himself persecuted, blacklisted. He couldn't even get a job at The Nation. He ends up printing I.F. Stone's Weekly in his basement, as you said, not only about the Vietnam War, but about the Korean War, exposing many atrocities in the Korean War. But there was this marriage, and then we'll go in and talk about Exodus, the book and the movie, and I find that coupling kind of fascinating.
Well, one of the things I think was the attraction on the left to the socialist vision of Israel, the kibbutz, which how many books were written about that? This was the future possibility, not only for leftists but for feminists. You know, you had collective child rearing, collective meal preparation, all of the kind of domestic tasks that were thought to be oppressive for women are shared in a different kind of arrangement. So I think that was one thing, and certainly that attracted him, as well as Frieda Kirschway at the Nation and others. This was a kind of socialist experiment that was very attractive and very possible. The other was the notion, and she uses this term several times in the course of the book, of the invincible victims. That is, on the one hand, Jews had been victims of horrific treatment in Europe, and historically victims of anti-Semitisms of all kinds. But here they were invincible. That is, they were going to prevail. There was a kind of resilience that could be admired rather than the kind of awful notion of victimization. The notion of resistance is important to the left as well. The Warsaw Ghetto becomes a kind of proof, the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto becomes a proof of the fact that Jews are they're not just pathetic victims. They're, as she calls them again, invincible victims. That is, whatever happens, there's a kind of resilience and resistance that prevails, and that Israel then becomes the embodiment for many people on the left as a result of that, I think.
Well, she talks later about the importance of the Holocaust, but it's important to note that initially, with the establishment of the State of Israel, those refugees from Europe, victims of the Holocaust, were considered somewhat shameful for not having resisted. And it was only later that the Holocaust became part of Jewish identity and a trope and a part of, but not initially, not at first. And of course, as you well know, the irony of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is that the only deputy commander of the uprising, Marek Edelman, condemned the apartheid state, the settler-colonial state, recognized Palestinians' right to self-determination and resistance, even armed resistance, drawing analogies between his resistance, the resistance he and the ghetto fighters carried out in Warsaw, and the resistance in Palestine. And so on the one hand, yes, they used the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but the only major historical figure was an anathema, was a pariah in Israel itself.
Well, one of the things, just you're mentioning that, one of the things she tracks really nicely is the way in which there is always a dissenting voice like his, like others, even when she talks about the history of the founding of the State of Israel. There were many people, Hannah Arendt, Martin Buber, who who thought that the idea of a Jewish homeland, a Jewish state, was a dangerous ethno-national way of thinking about a place, a homeland, or a place where Jews could come. But what she shows so clearly is how carefully and ruthlessly those positions were eclipsed. Those voices were, if not silenced, were just so muted that they couldn't be heard. And this, your notion of Gramsci, I think, is right. This hegemonic vision, cultural sort of appreciation of the importance of Israel for America, prevails every time. There are places in chapters where you think, oh, good, there's some criticism being articulated here, and she goes into it at some length, and then you just watch it being slapped down by the major forces of the media, by politicians, and by what becomes defined as the Israel lobby, or the lobbyists who are going to the Anti-Defamation League and what becomes AIPAC. Those groups acquire a predominance that manages to silence any kind of criticism.
Well, Yeshayahu Leibowitz, we should mention, the great Israeli philosopher who saw it all coming, where we are. I also want to talk about journalists, because she got it. I mean, the way journalists, there's two things, having spent 20 years overseas, I found with people, especially people who parachuted in, because they really didn't understand the situation around them. They immediately deform the situation to make it palatable for an American audience, but to Americanize it. And so there's she talks immediately after, of course, 750,000 Palestinians are dispossessed. Jaffa was largely a Palestinian city, completely emptied, and ethnic cleansing. Thousands were killed, the Deir Yassin massacre. And then you have the journalists who come from the United States, and they report about it, and they can't even see what's in front of their eyes. There's this passage, he's writing about Frida Kirchwey, who visited the silent, quote-unquote, silent and deserted city of Jaffa to address the question, why did the Arabs run? She registered the momentousness of more than 50,000 people fleeing from Palestine's largest Arab city, and she briefly noted the attack and siege by the combined forces of the Irgun, this was an underground terrorist group led by Begin, right? And the Haganah, which was the more established Israeli, militia army at the end of April. Yet, she did not mention the impact of this attack on the population. Instead, she claimed that the mass flight from Jaffa and from other Palestinian cities and villages seemed to have little to do with the fighting itself. At stake, this is going on at the bottom of the paragraph, at stake for Kirchwey in the image of the humane soldier was her investment in the Jewish refugee as a universal symbol of noble suffering and the creation of the Jewish state as a moral triumph for civilization over fascism. I saw that every war, every place I ever covered, I fought it, but I had to fight not only the mythic narrative that was being peddled to the American public, but my own colleagues in the press. Now, because I was with the New York Times, I didn't come and go. I lived there. I mean, I was 6 years in Latin America, 7 years in the Middle East. But these people who parachuted in, who didn't have any linguistic facility and didn't have really any historical knowledge, immediately fed the kind of tropes that Americans can understand and that allowed them to make sense of what they didn't understand. And she gets that really really well in the book.
Yeah. Well, I also think that it comes also from the notion that some of these journalists think they have to feed what you said a minute ago. They have to feed the information in terms that their readers can already understand, rather than understanding their role as producing knowledge that people then have to deal with. And that you see that now dramatically in journalism covering the Gaza war. It's the fear that they will offend readers is far greater than the notion that their job is to communicate to readers information that might not be comfortable, but that they need to really know. And I think you're right. She shows you with very fine-tuned analysis.
Yeah.
How
Well,
that
very
operates.
very clear examples.
Yeah, yeah. And how that operates. But I think that's what we're living with now.
Of course.
Doesn't the New York Times have a list of words you're not allowed to
Yeah.
use?
Yeah. Well, and it's
Yeah,
when they talk
gospel.
about the student encampments, they characterize them as they harass Jewish students. Jewish students may have been harassed, but the bulk of the repression was carried out against the protesters, 100 of whom were arrested on the campus of Columbia, people who've been deported, people who've been suspended. Ruha Benjamin at Princeton is teaching under probation. That goes unmentioned. And so, yes, you do see it now. And of course, we should be also note the fact that and this is something I and other international journalists went to Egypt to protest, is Israel has locked out there's no foreign press in Gaza.
Right.
For the obvious reasons, and over 120, I think, Palestinian journalists have been killed. Many of them targeted.